Up until now, everything I've discussed has been focused on fixing the behavior of the common man: education, labor market, obesity. But to finish off this series, it's time we take a look at the bigwigs, the ruling class. How do we fix the media and the government? Pew Research found that the percentage of Americans who say they trust the government to do what is right most of the time has decreased from 60 to 20% in the last 20 years, with the highest amount of trust coming immediately after 9/11. Similarly, only 26% of people have a favorable opinion of American news media. In fact, 50% of Americans believe that most national news organizations are intentionally trying to mislead and misinform the public. This distrust hasn't reflected itself in Democratic participation, however. If anything, more people are voting now than ever before. But I'm not sure how long that will last. The lack of faith in our democracy is growing by the day. In 2018, 70% of Americans trusted electoral votes to be counted accurately, but that has plummeted to 59% in 2020 and creeped up to 63% in 2022. But looking across party lines shows how partisan this issue is. In the 2022 election, 85% of Democrat voters were confident in the electoral process, but only 40% of Republican voters were. This unbelievable partisanship is shown in the media as well. According to Gallup, 14% of Republicans, 20% of independents, and 70% of Democrats report trusting mass media. The closer I looked at this graph, the more remarkable I found it. Democrat, independent, and Republican trust in media were all declining steadily for over a decade, and then in 2016, everything changed. The Democrats' trust in media exploded upwards and the Republican trust sharply dropped down. The Democrats' trust is especially concerning to me. It seems like just the latest example of how rapidly the left has moved farther left. The meme that Elon Musk posted seems to be more true every day. You see, in 2016, the Democratic Party seemed to lose its identity completely and simply become the anti-Trump party. Everything that Trump was against was good, and everything he supported was bad. In less than 10 years, the left has gone from being reasonably skeptical of the media to being blindly loyal. It's gone from representing the middle class and fighting corporate America to being big tech and big pharma's most enthusiastic cheerleaders, and it's gone from being the anti-war party to sending $50 billion in military assistance to Ukraine. Fortunately, the falling trust in media and government hasn't resulted in complete cynicism, not even on the right. But I'm afraid that it isn't sustainable. People haven't started abandoning the polls yet, but what if they do? If people stop voting or believe that their votes don't matter, then they'll try to change things by any other means. If the people can't trust the news, then they can't trust anything or anyone, including each other. Unfortunately, we've been given great reason to be cynical. The will of the people is practically irrelevant to policymakers. A study done on over 1,700 policy issues found that the political preference of the average citizen has little to no impact on the likelihood of that change being adopted. On the flip side, policies favored by the wealthiest 90% of Americans and interest groups have a much higher likelihood of adoption. Similarly, we know that the news feeds off of our negative emotions. It's incentivized to antagonize. This is backed by plenty of research, whether it's on tweets, news headlines, or magazine covers. I know I've said this on every chapter, but this might be the most important sector of all. How do we change the country if the most powerful people and institutions are incentivized to ruin it? How do we fight and prevent institutional corruption? I think it helps to separate that into two questions. The methods by which we fight corruption and prevent corruption will be much different. A key point to preventing corruption is to keep in mind that corruption is motivated by power. Power corrupts, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. To prevent people from becoming corrupt, we must both limit how powerful they can become and regulate the ways in which power is amassed. Power, in the modern day, comes mainly in the form of money, and thus we must get the money out of politics. The only way a politician gets elected is by campaigning, and campaigning is an incredibly expensive process. Trump and Biden's 2020 campaigns raised a combined $1.8 billion. When factoring in all the money spent during the 2022 election for the presidency, you get a total of $5.7 billion, and for the congressional races, $8.7 billion. This made the 2020 election cycle by far the most expensive of all time, for a total of over $14 billion spent on political campaigns. Expensive campaigns means lots of fundraising. And this is the heart of corruption. In order to get elected, you must campaign. In order to campaign, you must raise money. And in order to raise money, you must promise to act in the interest of the richest people who have money to give. This means that the more money you have to give, the more influence you have on the success of a political candidate. Looking again at 2020, the Trump campaign's top 3 donors were Las Vegas Sands, Adelson Clinic, and America First for a combined $127 million. And the Biden campaign's top 3 donors were Bloomberg, Future Forward USA, and Asana for a combined $201 million. In a country with a population of over 330 million people, the top 1% of donors make up 93% of all donated money, and the top 100 donors give 67% of all money donated. In the United States, the top 100 donors have twice as much financial influence as the rest of the 300 million people in the country combined. If money translated directly to voting, that would be like if the top 100 richest donors got to vote 3 million times each. Speaking of money translating perfectly to voting, the candidate who spends more money almost always wins. In 2022, 93% of winning candidates in the House and 82% of winning candidates in the Senate were the candidates who spent the most money campaigning. When you consider that the House of Representatives serve only 2-year terms and presidents 4-year terms, we have a system where most elected officials spend the majority of their time and money campaigning. But it's not like our elected officials are free from the grasp of corporate interests once they get into office, because lobbying is a billion-dollar industry as well. If you're unfamiliar, the basic definition of lobbying is an organized effort to persuade a government official or government body to implement policy the lobbyers want to see. On its face, it's not a bad thing. It's actually a good thing protected by the First Amendment. In practice, however, it faces the same problem as campaign funding does. The entities with the most resources are able to better argue for their positions, and therefore are more influential in the government. In other words, the average man may have the most brilliant ideas in the country, but a team of highly experienced lawyers will be able to better argue for their ideas. It's the same reason why you're advised to not represent yourself in court. Not because you're not innocent, but because you're not as capable of arguing for your innocence. In the same way, shareholders don't argue for their own interests. They hire lawyers from a lobbying firm to argue on their behalf. It's essentially political muscle for hire, and corporations will pay top dollar. In 2022, the pharmaceutical industry spent more than any other on lobbying at $375 million in just 1 year. Some of the biggest spenders are $15 million from Pfizer, $10 million from Roche, $8 million from Merck & Co., and $8 million from Johnson & Johnson. Staying in the realm of health, over the last 6 years, the food industry, companies like Coke, Pepsi, Kellogg's, Tyson, and Nestle, spent over $35 million per year, for a total of $210 million over the last 6 years for the sole purpose of influencing the government. This is why I mentioned in the chapter on obesity that so long as campaign financing and lobbying is structured in this way, the government won't take any meaningful steps towards solving the American diet and enabling people to be healthier. All this money towards lobbying has real-world effects on policy. In 2010, Congress enacted the Hungry Free Kids Act, which required school lunches to make changes towards being healthier. The Department of Agriculture created a nutritional guideline for schools to follow in compliance with this law, specifically cutting back on starchy foods and instead promoting more nutrient-dense options. But junk food corporations like American Frozen Food Institute, Coca-Cola, and Del Monte spent $6 million in lobbying and successfully convinced senators to block those guidelines. Considering what a measly $6 million can do, the following numbers should terrify you. In the last 20 years, the following industries spent this much on lobbying: Big Pharma, $5.5 billion. Insurance, $3.5 billion. Oil and gas, $2.7 billion. Real estate, $2 billion. Entertainment, $1.4 billion. Automotive, $1.5 billion. The list goes on. Thousands of lobbyists representing hundreds of corporations with billions of dollars are constantly pulling on the strings of our government, and they don't even have to be American. Foreign nations are allowed to lobby in our government as well, like in 2012 when former CIA and FBI directors were hired to lobby against classifying allies of Saddam Hussein as terrorists. Those men were paid $10,000 to $50,000 each to give speeches defending this group across the world. Looking at last year, 2022, the top foreign lobbyer was China at $62 million, followed by Marshall Islands and Japan at $46 million, and other countries like Saudi Arabia and Qatar also above $20 million. Our biggest rival, China, has spent over $300 million lobbying in the United States since 2016. The game is already rigged, it's already corrupt and unfair, and yet on top of that, there are still cheaters. The phenomenon I'd like to focus on is called the revolving door. While the lobbying system I described is certainly flawed, it isn't explicitly corrupt in theory. There are a lot of resources dedicated to influencing politicians' opinions, but in the end, that money is going to lobbyists, not the politicians themselves, and so they aren't made to vote against what they honestly believe, even if what they honestly believe was influenced. That's where the revolving door comes in. It's a name given to describe the tendency for politicians and lobbyists to frequently switch positions. That is, politicians often become lobbyists, and lobbyists often become politicians. The conspiracy theory is this: government officials who are cooperative with certain lobbyists are promised jobs with that firm after their term ends, and those jobs can pay incredibly high salaries. This way, the lobbyists get their agenda pushed through Congress, and the government official gets a large amount of money once they leave office. It's a win-win. A great example of the revolving door is Representative Billy Tauzin. Billy Tauzin added concessions to the Medicare Act of 2003 that would make pharmaceutical companies more money. Then, the day after he left Congress in 2005, he was hired as the head executive of Pharmaceutical Research and Manufacturers of America, where he earned $2 million a year. Tauzin might have been a high-profile case, but he's far from the only one to engage in this behavior. Of the members who remain employed, 49% of former members of the 2017 Congress are now lobbyists, 69% of the 2015 Congress, 50% of the 2013, etc. When you break it down by industry, Big Pharma comes out on top yet again, with over 1,000 lobbyists being former government officials. There are also 660 insurance lobbyists and 600 education lobbyists. The point is this: there is so much money wrapped up in politics and so many examples of corruption that it's clear there is too much temptation and too much conflict of interest in Washington. If we want government to represent the people, it needs to stop representing corporate interests, and the only way to do that is by taking the money out of politics. So I believe that taking money out of politics is how we prevent corruption. But unfortunately, we failed to do that. The corruption has already festered. Now we are tasked with fighting it. For the average person, I think the best thing to do is to be educated and start small. If you're educated on the history of corruption and propaganda in America, and you take that knowledge with you to your local elections, I think that is the best method to building up the snowball of change. The problem is that most people don't have the time to really pay close attention to politics, and if you choose to make time, it consumes your life. That's definitely what happened to me through making this series. How did we get so uninformed in the first place? Well, there's the media that comes into play. What we've seen in the realm of mainstream news is extreme media consolidation. That is, media companies merging and acquiring others. Today, it's estimated that 6 companies control 90% of the media industry. That's Disney, Paramount, Comcast, Sony, AT&T, and Fox. The synchronization of mass media has led to the rise in independent journalism and what some call the divide between new media and legacy media.
Of biased and false news has become all too common on social media. An agenda to control exactly what people think, and this is extremely dangerous to our democracy.
Ironically, the consolidation of media actually leads people to getting different information because no one wants to listen to the mainstream and instead looks for smaller media outlets that confirm their biases. These echo chambers are easy to dwell in indefinitely because of social media recommendation algorithms constantly feeding the people what will get them the most clicks, which studies have shown are negative headlines. The media is not concerned with accurately portraying reality. They're concerned with setting narratives and getting the most clicks by feeding you outrage and fear. To prove my point, I analyzed every single article published by CNN in the year 2020. Looking at 54,000 articles, I found that the prevalence of a problem and the frequency with which that problem is covered is weakly related. In late March and early April, COVID deaths spiked at over 15,000 per week, and COVID articles also spiked at around 400 per week. As the initial COVID panic died down, so did the frequency of articles. And then in the winter, we see that weekly COVID deaths hit an all-time high at nearly 25,000 per week, yet COVID articles hit an all-time low at only 100 per week. It's clear that the public and CNN just got bored of COVID. It wasn't riling people up enough to get them clicks anymore, so they moved on to other topics, even though COVID was statistically at its worst point ever. This trend is even more egregious with police brutality. In March, April, and May, the amount of black people killed by police was at its highest 3-month stretch in the entire year, yet articles about the police were at the lowest point of the entire year. We see a huge spike in June after George Floyd was murdered, and articles about the police remained at elevated levels until October, even though police killings reached its lowest point in this time frame. I decided to hone in further and be even more specific. I selected out only the articles by CNN that explicitly covered police harming or mistreating black people, and found that in 2020, there were 85 such articles. 7 of them in the first 5 months of the year before George Floyd, and 78 of them were published in the last 7 months. This is not a coincidence. It's because CNN knew that fear sells. I also did this process for white people being mistreated by police. I found that in 2020, 256 black people were killed by police, and there were 85 CNN articles about police mistreating black people. There were 418 white people killed by police, and 0 articles about police mistreating white people. Major news networks are not in the business of accurately portraying reality. They're simply in the business of getting you glued to your screen, and the best way to do that is to feed on your fears and preconceptions. And don't forget that even if the mass media wanted to accurately portray reality, they're still compromised because they are beholden to advertiser dollars. They need the money from big corporations to stay competitive, which is exactly the point I made about politicians. In 2021, Procter & Gamble, who you know I am not a fan of if you watched episode 2 of this series, led the US with over $8 billion spent on advertising. Other companies like McDonald's is at $2 billion, Coca-Cola at $2 billion, Nestle $2.5 billion, etc. Take YouTube, for example, and how many times they've increased censorship in an effort to keep advertiser dollars coming in. Do you think network news outlets are any different? Don't you think that the mainstream media probably hesitates to push certain stories or cover certain topics that might upset their advertisers? For example, Otelsa was giving Fox and CNN each over $1 million a month in 2018. Do you think they would cover stories about adverse effects in patients who took that drug? I don't know how else to say it other than that the media pushes propaganda relentlessly. What baffles me is that people have such short-term memory. The US lied about weapons of mass destruction to invade Iraq. The US lied about the Gulf of Tonkin to escalate conflict with Vietnam. Yet today, the same people who are aware of this support us sending money and ammunition to prop up a proxy war in Ukraine. Housewives in the 60s were told that amphetamines were a healthy way to deal with boredom and depression. Big Tobacco got scientists to tell the American public that cigarettes weren't harmful. Yet the same people who claim to be anti-big pharma support transgender hormones and antidepressants. That's not to say I don't have blind spots, I certainly do, but it's also true that everyone thinks the media is brainwashing people, but nobody thinks they're brainwashed. I think we need to have a more educated and tolerant society. We need to be able to hear different perspectives from one another. Elon Musk has done a good job at Twitter, making it open to different perspectives, but even then, there were plenty of people who opposed that move, who didn't want social media to be a haven for free speech. Unfortunately, the word misinformation has become cringe, but it is true that lots of people are being misled. The answer, however, is just as cliché. The only way to combat bad speech is with more good speech. So instead of cowardly dismissing people we don't agree with like Peter Hotez does, we need to be tolerant of other perspectives to get closer to the truth. The issue of social awareness and education is also tied to every other issue I addressed in this series. If kids grew up in a stable home, their parents would be able to guide them and disperse information to them. If people's diets were better, they would be less emotional and think clearly, being able to think through information and be skeptical in a healthy way. If the labor market was better, people would have more time to stay up to date and be educated. And I suppose that's the running theme of this entire series. Everything plays into each other, and fighting corruption is no different. The political sector of America is the most out of reach of the average person's day-to-day life, but it certainly doesn't have a negligible impact. I believe that media and government distrust is a terrible issue facing the country, and we must restore faith in society to have a well-functioning and optimistic country. By getting the money out of politics and keeping people educated on how propaganda comes for them through embracing free speech, we can fight and prevent corruption in the news and political system. This issue is of the utmost importance. If you agree with my analysis, please share this with anyone who will listen, and if you don't, let your voice be heard. We must exchange ideas and repair American politics. The future of our government and our country depend on it.